Let's start with the rhetoric. Do you worry that Democrats will be tied to rhetoric like this when we hear abolish ICE equated with defund the police? Senator Ted Cruz was on the program last evening decrying Democrats' use of the term Nazi in that case. How worried are you about this moment we're in?
Well, first, the only people I hear using the term defund the police anymore are Republicans saying that Democrats stand for that when that's patently false. I have never stood for that, and I've actually publicly, going back years, criticized that sort of rhetoric. That, again, I don't know one elected Democratic colleague of mine in Congress who supports that or uses that phrase. I do understand, though, why Ted Cruz and other Republicans want to distract from the issues. Because let's face it, they're very afraid about this November midterm election. We just saw a special election in Texas in which a Democratic candidate won a district that Donald Trump had won last November in a landslide. So we're in an environment right now in which Democrats are overperforming by double digits on average every single special election that's taken place ever since January of last year. So it's not surprising to me that Republicans want to talk about anything other than their pitiful record in office.
Well, I'm sure you've seen this letter that I refer to. It is addressed to Mike Johnson and John Thune. It is from your leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, and the Senate leader for Democrats, the Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer. Targeted enforcement is number one. There are 10 on here. DHS officers cannot enter private property without a judicial warrant. This is something Republicans have pushed back hard on, suggesting it would simply take too long for an enforcement action to come together. Number two, Congressman, has been extremely controversial, which is curious to some, and that's demasking. No masks allowed. Prohibit ICE and immigration enforcement agents from wearing face coverings. John Cornyn, 2 days ago on Bloomberg, called that an insult to the agents. Is this going to be the sticking point on a deal?
Well, I have to say I'm very confused by that, although I understand why John Cornyn wants to pretend to be more conservative than he is at the moment, facing a very difficult Republican primary for re-election. You know, I represent a lot of Philadelphia police officers, live in a neighborhood that actually has a lot of Philly police. The officers here in Philadelphia, and indeed every community in the country, they don't wear masks. They're public people. They're professionals. They wear uniforms. They have their names in the right by their chests. Their faces are visible. Why is ICE any different? Why is ICE acting like they're somehow above the law? Why should they get special treatment? You know, one of the reasons why law enforcement doesn't wear masks is because they want to have the trust of the community. I think that ICE is, and again, I have respect for anyone who's in law enforcement. I've always said that this is one of the most difficult jobs in society. But I think the majority of the American people, as polling shows, are pretty disturbed by what we're seeing in terms of what's happening on the streets of Minneapolis and the way ICE is conducting itself. So I'm someone who has always been pro-law enforcement, understands the difficult jobs they have, but also recognizes that we see real chaos and mayhem on the streets of Minneapolis that isn't making any of us safer. Frankly, it's making us less safe.
So what's more likely here with 8 days to go? A deal that resembles this list of restrictions, or a 1 year or full year CR for the Department of Homeland Security?
Well, so just to be clear, I think reining in ICE and having it act like a normal law enforcement agency is the appropriate and right policy. I think a pretty solid majority of Americans agree with me on that, as recent polling has showed. Now, the question is, will the Trump White House back down and accept that over the course of the next 8 days? I have to be honest, I'm very skeptical that that will happen. So I do fear that specifically to DHS, that we will face either another CR or possibly a long shutdown. The quicker that this White House recognizes that the way ICE is behaving is not right and not helping achieve their stated mission is the best route to go.
Do you worry that Philadelphia is on the list? What happens if Dan Bongino shows up in your town, your neighborhood?
I have to say, I would not, and I have a number of friends who are in Minneapolis. They've talked about just how horrific it's been. I certainly don't want to see that on the streets of Philadelphia. By the way, I would point out, if you mind a moment of bragging, Philadelphia had fewer violent crimes last year and fewer murders than at any point in the last 60 years. So this is literally the safest, and I say this as someone who's a born and raised Philadelphian and represents the district where he grew up. Philadelphia has actually never been safer at any point in my lifetime than it is now. That's something that we should celebrate and that other communities can learn from. The last thing we need is a repeat of Minneapolis here on the streets of Philadelphia.
Well, this is a heck of a time to be a member of Congress. Once this is resolved and we start getting into the throes of primary season, Congressman, what's the appropriations process going to be like from your view on the Budget Committee? Do we go into campaign mode, or is there going to be an agenda for this Congress? So I suspect you're going to point me to Mike Johnson on that one.
Well, the reality is with 2-year terms, by the way, the provision of the Constitution my wife most dislikes, the fact that members of the House of Representatives have to run every 2 years. I don't think you're ever really out of election cycle. On the positive, it does keep you connected to the community that you represent. I'm back home here in Philadelphia because we adjourned session late yesterday. So, I think that over the last dozen years or so that I've been in Congress, I've been able to balance the Washington, D.C. aspect of the job. As ranking member of the Budget Committee, it's obviously an enormously time-consuming position that I have within the Congress, yet at the same time being back home and being connected to the constituents that I represent. So I don't foresee any sort of change over the next few months compared to the way it's been the previous year, with one exception. Perhaps when we get beyond these primary dates and primary elections, perhaps we will see more House Republicans finally begin to break from this White House and actually vote according to how they actually act in private and what they say about the Trump White House in private, but are too afraid to say that or to act on that in public because they're so afraid of their Republican primary electorate. As they're facing what will probably be a very difficult midterm election in November, I think you will see more and more of them attempt to drive some distance between themselves and the Trump White House because it'll be in their electoral best interest to do so.